Wuthering Waves just made a massive mistake and they need to fix this because Japan is pissed. And you know what happens when Japan gets pissed. Many of us playing Wuthering Waves knows that there's been a decent amount of localization issues that have been taking place. One on the English side that still bothers me a lot is the one that says invite to co-op, when in reality, that's not actually invite to co-op, that's requesting to join somebody else's world, which is super confusing, as well as some other translations in the settings. For example, on the visual setting for brightness, this isn't actually brightness, this is gamma. These localization issues are found all throughout the game, but now they've just stepped on a bit of a landmine on the JP side, and there's something they're really going to have to correct. Now, I want to give special shout out to Ryuku Sensei for giving us some JP translations of what's been going on their end, but you may have already seen this come through your mail where they're talking about a translation issue for Ji-Yan's weapon. Reading it here, that we can see that the damage buff for all resonance attributes is for every time an intro skill or resonance liberation is cast, but what happened on the JP side is that was not resonance liberation, that was translated as resonance skill, which is a big difference. The rate at which you're getting to activate Ji-Yan's skill versus activating his ultimate is pretty big, and so the amount of damage that you would have been able to do if that had been swapped to the skill is pretty big, which resulted in a lot of people on the JP side spending a lot of money on Ji-Yan's weapon. But now that they've realized that that translation error has occurred, they're very upset by that. And I'm gonna be honest, I would be pretty pissed too if I had wailed on this weapon thinking it did one thing, but it did another. Now, I want to be clear before we get deeper into this that I'm a big fan of Wuthering Waves, and I think it is a very promising game, and I still think it has a very promising future, but I do think mistakes like this need to be corrected in the right way, not only from a social perspective, but just from an all-around trust perspective in the product. I've been critical of other companies like Nexon and what they've done with games like MapleStory. Now, that was a little bit more nefarious, and I'm not trying to say that's the same thing here, but I've been critical of games when they've made those kind of mistakes, and I think we need to be fair about what's going on with Wuthering Waves as well. Now, as I have said before, JP has been spending a lot of money on this weapon, and they are very upset that the translations were not correct. So much so that there have been threats of reporting them to the Consumer Affairs Agency in Japan. Now, this is where you may have seen some circulation of people saying that Wuthering Waves is getting sued or that Kuro Games is getting sued. As of right now, when I'm recording this video, there's been no confirmation of any actual suits being filed. These have just been threats for what has happened. So if anybody's saying that they are getting sued without any other kind of proof, tell them they're lying. Because as far as we know right now, no suits have been filed. Now, one thing we have to make abundantly clear is that Kuro Games did make a mistake here. The translation was incorrect, so much so that they did release compensation. However, the compensation they gave was 160 asterite. That's the equivalent of 1 pull. And I'm not saying because they've been generous with other things that they need to be as generous with this, but I'm gonna say that this is a pretty big blunder to make, and I think there needs to be a little more of a reconciliation here. Japan is a major market when it comes to gacha game spending, massively outpacing basically every other country on the planet for its gacha game spending. They're just mobile gamers by heart. They're used to spending in that kind of medium. Something that's still a lot newer to us in the West is more ingrained into common gaming culture there. And they need to do something about it so that they don't hurt their revenue on that side. I do think their revenue could be hit by this issue if they don't do something more. And that is simply because whales need to have confidence in what they're spending on. I know we've been having a lot of conversations on the Western side of the gacha space, talking about the difference between free-to-play players and whale players and what's the best way to play the game, to experience the game. And we've seen a lot of people bitching about it online between Tectone and Fob, going back and forth. Some people calling free-to-play players cucks, just watching other people get to have sex with their favorite characters because of how much money they're spending on it. And it's just like, look, well, that's all in good fun. We have to remember something at the end of the day, that the game is funded basically by whales. A lot of this came to the forefront for a lot of us in the West, especially with the advent of Diablo Immortal, where there was leaked communication about the idea of whale hunting in your gacha games, implementing systems that's going to attract the high spending players because that's where the majority of the money you're going to make is. Well, yes, I'm sure there are tons of players that do the daily passes and the people that do the battle passes on a monthly basis. And of course, that's going to be a little bit of revenue, especially when you're talking about millions of people who are going to play the game. But it takes a ton of free-to-play players to equate to one whale who's able to drop thousands of dollars $100 on just a few weeks of the game's release, when you're not even taking into consideration the thousands of dollars they will probably spend on subsequent characters that they release. They massively outpace in terms of a percentage of how much revenue a game makes. So if a whale does not have confidence in the product that they're spending on, they're not going to spend money on that game, which is going to hurt the game's bottom line. And don't get me wrong, if you want to keep being a free-to-play player on this game to enjoy the game, you kind of need whales to carry. Let's be clear there. If they're not making money, they're not going to keep making the game, okay? Like, that's just the reality of the situation. So they need to do something, I think, to appease the whales. And I think there are definitely some more things that they can do because other gacha games have done it before. For example, other games like Epic 7 have done character recalls before. If a game ever needs to nerf a character's kit and make them less valuable in any way, shape, or form, there usually needs to be some way to return that character or swap it for something of equal value, which is something that happened just 4 months ago in Epic 7 when they decreased a character's effectiveness in terms of changing their kit. They gave them a recall, which allowed them to fully refund a character and all resources that were put into that character and exchange them for a character of equal value. I think that could be a fair approach here. So I've got 3 solutions that I think Wuthering Waves could use to fix this situation. I don't want to just sit here and complain about things that they need to do something. I want to actually give, I think, some actionable advice. Now, I'm going to take 2 things off the table immediately. And the first one I think that we need to take off is just the opportunity of a full cash refund. That is never going to happen, especially when you take into consideration the amount of currency jumping that takes place in Wuthering Waves. When you first buy currency in Wuthering Waves, you don't even get the asterite directly. It first needs to be converted from the premium currency in the game. And that premium currency is called Lunite. So you're converting Lunite into asterite and then asterite into the currency to pull on the weapon banner. And the amount of jumping that needs to happen there, you get lost on the dollar value that's been added. So I just don't think there's any reasonable way that they can refund a cash value here because you can't determine how much of a pack that was purchased was used specifically portioned for the weapon. I also don't think it's a great idea to just buff the weapon to the way that the players thought it was going to work. I think that is a pretty big buff to a weapon at this stage of the game. Feels like a pretty big overstep or not a great long-term approach to it. We've seen other games make the mistake of over buffing characters or having too strong a characters on release that there's just no one else that can compete. A perfect example is Bennett in Genshin Impact, who is still one of the best supports, if not the best support in Genshin Impact, especially if you haven't done his Constellation 6. You can literally use him in every team and he's just going to be a net benefit. I think having something of the equivalent value in Wuthering Waves isn't necessarily a great idea moving forward. Because remember, we have to find something here that's going to kind of work for both parties, in my opinion. So personally, I think there needs to be a recall of some kind. So the first option I think that's available is just a recall on the pulls. Kuro is fortunate enough to be in the 1.0 launch of the game. This is the first rate up character. So they could theoretically, if somebody elected to do so, roll back the person's banner and refund them any pulls that they have currently used on the Gion weapon banner. Now in this process, and to be fair, you would also lose the weapon. So you'd fully refund the weapon, get all resources you've used to raise that weapon back, as well as any pulls that you've put into Gion's banner. Just kind of giving you a hard reset on that weapon and the weapon banner. I think that's a pretty fair approach if we wanted to do that. Now, is there potentially a little bit of a dollar value lost there? I don't know. It kind of depends on each player's situation. I think it gives some people an opportunity to refund who maybe didn't actually spend money on it and they just want to maybe try and re-roll on it. I think as long as it's limited to people who have actually pulled the weapon, it's not going to give like free re-rolling for people who've been trying to roll on the weapon and just haven't gotten it yet. Like if you haven't gotten the weapon, you weren't going to get it anyway, so don't give them the refund, but somebody who has a weapon has that opportunity to roll back. And like I said, that rollback process would just roll back into weapon pulls so they could choose to use those weapon pulls on a future banner. Now, a second option here as well would just be to refund that fully back, but just into asterite instead of just on the weapon banner, so they could choose to repurpose those pulls into another banner or into another character if they so chose. But I think that's probably less appealing. I know I'm gonna sound like a shill here, but I feel like that might be a little bit too generous of a refund in this case, because I don't think it's like that big a change on the weapon that it's worth a full 100% refund into pure asterite to fully redo that. I don't know, maybe I'm out of touch here, but that's just my approach to it. But I think that's theoretically still an option. The third option though, I think would be to take a page out of Epic 7's book for the recall and swap, which would allow basically for as many weapons as you have pulled on the banners. So let's say you've gotten a sequence 5 version of the Verdant Summit, you could recall that weapon, which would recall it into its 5 forms, get all of the resources back that you've used to raise that weapon, and then for each of those weapons, you could then use to exchange a weapon on the standard banner. This would basically allow you to pick from any of the 5 weapons that you would normally be able to pull on the banner for. Now, I think this is fair because this banner is also a 100% rate up banner. There's no 50-50. And so the amount that you've spent on just trying to get the duplicates for Gion's weapon, you could use to swap for weapons on this banner instead, or keep swapping it for the same. So for example, if you think the Winterbroom Broadblade is better than Gion's rate up weapon because of the changes, you could theoretically refund all 5 of those for 5 of the Lustrous Razor. I think that's a pretty fair swap because you're not necessarily getting a full refund, but you're just kind of exchanging it for an item of equal value that you could have gotten for the same value, because the pulls are a 1-to-1 conversion, and because both banners are 100% rate up with you getting to select the weapon that you want to pull for, you're just basically exchanging it for another product. I think that's a pretty fair approach. Full refund of resources and being able to swap it for one of the standard weapons if you so chose. Personally, I am partial to that option. I think it's one that will appease most people. Also, if you've got multiple 5 stars, it allows you to get the different 5-star weapons for those characters too, kind of spreading the love a little bit. But that's just my thoughts. Let me know what you think down below. What do you think is the right way to correct this situation? Do you think Wuthering Waves needs to approach a more full refund approach? I still don't think a cash value is on the table. I just don't think that makes any sense. I just don't think it's possible to track that degree of value. So I think some kind of recall is in order personally to keep confidence in the spending on this game and to keep confidence on the product. But let me know what you think in the comments down below. I'd greatly appreciate that. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching. Greatly appreciate you and your time. Shout out to all these subscribers and patrons who support me in what I do. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.